Welcome to another episode of Becoming a Techno Wizard. Today we're learning about Hegel once again. Hegel, and the phenomenology of spirit. So, gonna do my normal rigmarole and share this out with folks, and then we'll go ahead and get started. But let me see. I pulled up my last episode last time. Here's how I summarized what we learned last week in section 26 of this book. Hegel speaks about the conflict between the individual as something for itself or self-evident, um, as something for itself, or as a self-evident thing, and versus science as something in itself or self-affirming. He shows how each side views the other as only half truthful and lacking in terms of spirit or the conscious mind. We as individuals have an intrinsic value for ourselves just on the basis of existing. To many of us, science, meaning any objective knowledge, has to be applied to our lives before we can see its value and truth. On the other hand, science is a system of knowledge seeking in which can explain more about the world than any one or even group of us can understand or explain. From the perspective of science, individuals are kind of small-minded in our scope and understanding of the world. Therefore, spirit, i.e., consciousness, is split between these two ends. Individuals cannot explain or adequately describe what it means to be conscious, but science also cannot yet explain what it actually is consciousness. To do that, we must bring the two together, and this next section will begin to get into how all that will work. And hopefully that gives us a good overview of what we did last time, and we can get into the show. Bow.
It is this coming to be of science as such, or of knowledge, that is described in this phenomenology of spirit. Knowledge in its first phase, or immediate spirit, is the non-spiritual, that is, sense consciousness. In order to become genuine knowledge, to beget the element of science which is the pure notion of science itself, it must travel a long way and work its passage. This process of coming to be, considering the content and patterns it will display therein, will not be what is commonly understood by an initiation of the unscientific consciousness into science.
Mm. Yeah, let's back up a little bit. In order to become genuine knowledge to beget, oh, we didn't start there. It is the coming to be of science as such of a knowledge as described in the phenomenology of spirit. Knowledge in its first phase or immediate spirit is the non-spiritual, i.e., the sense consciousness. That's interesting right there. The non-spiritual, the sense consciousness. Um, yeah, that's interesting because I've been reading recently about how um, it seems to be reading into complexity theory, where they mention how senses, right, the perspective or having a sense of perception is essentially a fairly complicated, early level of consciousness in which you're trying to get all this information into yourself. So it's interesting to see him, kind of describe that here as well.
Sense consciousness. In order
In order to become genuine knowledge, to beget the element of science, which is the pure notion of science itself, it must travel a long way and work its passage. Yeah. So basically, in order to for the sense consciousness, the what did he call it? Knowledge in its first phase, right? Yeah. In order for that to become the genuine knowledge or the full understanding of things, it seems, has to in order to create, science, this fundamental foundational understanding of the world, we have to travel a bit. We have to do a bit of work to get to that point. This process of coming to be, considering the content and patterns it will display therein, will not be what is commonly understood by an initiation of the unscientific consciousness into science. I think
an
that's where it started
initiation
there.
of the unscientific consciousness into science. It will also be quite different from the foundation of science.
Mm.
Least of all will it be like the rapturous enthusiasm, which, like a shot from a pistol, begins straight away with absolute knowledge and makes short work of other standpoints by declaring that it takes no notice of them.
Mm. Mm. Nicholas, thank you for coming to the stream. Says, I'm not sure that for itself, as Hegel uses that term, denotes self-evidence. To say that something is self-evidently true seems to be to say that it is true, not for a reason. Yeah, that could be a good point. And the reason why I say that is because, um, at least in the beginning, right, in this preface area, it seems to me that's what he was implying, right? Like the for itself portion, it can be self-evident, right? It's not like it's not for a reason, but like it takes some it takes it doesn't necessarily require an explanation, to of its own existence. However, because of that, it still needs to be coupled with, what we create with science in order to come together to form the full reasons and to understand what all that means. But because it is intuitively true, uh, oh, so I'm sorry, your thing wasn't complete here. So let's read that back. I'm not sure that for itself, as Hegel uses that term, denotes self-evidence. To say that something is self-evidently true seems to be to say that it is true not for a reason, but because it is intuitively true. Right. Okay. It seems that self-evidence is something like an I don't know how you say that word, epistemological status, not a metaphysical claim about the nature of that thing. Yeah. Okay. I can see that. Hmm. Interesting. Yeah. I do wonder what you still getting into that the it's not the difference, but the I don't want to say this. I guess the distinction between this epistemological status versus the metaphysical claim. Um, because either way, it still is that right, that self-evident truth, that intuitive. I think this is a problem here, right? For something to be self-evident doesn't necessarily mean we're thinking about it to be intuitively true, um, because truth in and of itself kind of implies a sense of work that we got there to determine this truth, right? At least for me, when I hear or say self-evidence, I'm thinking of like it is existing, right? You don't have to you don't have to point out that something like we know we're existing because we're thinking about something existing. If we assume something is, we just know that it is. We don't know what it is or what all it encompasses, like what all it encompasses that thing that it is, but we just know it is, right? At least that's how I kind of take this, but um, you make a point there, so I might be wrong on that self-evidence aspect. Let's see what you're saying here. Oh, right. Kami understood by an initiation of the scientific consciousness into science, and then he goes on to say it will also be quite different from the foundation of science. Least of all, will it be like the rapturous enthusiasm which, like a shot from a pistol, begins straight away with absolute knowledge and makes short work of other standpoints by declaring that it takes no notice of them. Mm, yeah, that's interesting. And it's oh, right. He's talking about the whole coming to be process of creating that sense of knowledge there, right? Where in that process seems to it will also be quite different from the foundation. Yeah, this is an interesting kind of metaphor here. I like that idea. Nicholas, yes, I think work is a big part of it, which is why I think Hegel would reject the claim that anything is self-evident. For itself, as I understand it, denotes the transition from formal possibility to actuality. Yeah, that's a great point. That's a great point. I should update that because right. Because and that's my own fault, right? Because self-evident literally means like self-evidence, like the evidence of itself. So that's a good point as well. Definitely. Yeah, I like that. Thank you for that. Something which is for itself is something which is actual, which has a kind of content to it. Yeah. Thank you, Nicholas. This is great. Absolutely phenomenal. Yeah. And that gets into I think he talked about that too, right? Like the actuality of things versus the I guess the potential of things. Um, I may be misremembering as well. Don't mean to get you off track. Just thought I put in my 2 cents. No, I appreciate it. I appreciate it. That's a good correction too on my last episode and my summary. I'm definitely gonna update after that, after this, to make sure that reflects a better, interpretation of all this. And I appreciate it definitely. Thank you again.
Science. Least of all will it be like the rapturous enthusiasm, which, like a shot from a pistol, begins straight away with absolute knowledge and makes short work of other standpoints by declaring that it takes no notice of them. So from section 26, we realize that on the one hand, the individual needs, in order to develop, in order to truly express what they are as spirit, as God.
Nicholas says, yes, it comes from Aristotle's distinction between the potential and the actual. Right. Okay. Awesome. So I was remembering that right. Thank you.
Science, and on the other hand, science is
All right,
in
Nicholas.
a
Thanks for dropping by. Hope to see you later. Feel free to put it in comments too when you get a chance to listen back. I appreciate it, man.
even when it's developed, a sort of unfinished state so long as it has not incorporated the individual into it, so long as science has not actually become conscious of itself. How's that going to take place? Well, here's where Hegel actually brings up the title of the book. What is the phenomenology of spirit? He says,
What is it?
it's this
Yes, let's go.
coming to be of science as such, or knowledge, that is described in this phenomenology of spirit. Now, why did he pick that title? Well, spirit, Geist, mind, encompassing everything from philosophy to religion to law to culture, to the natural sciences, to the arts. All those sorts of things are comprised within Geist. So the phenomenology of spirit, Phenomenology des Geistes, what is that about? It's about all these human activities, endeavors, achievements.
Mm.
So what does the phenomenology mean then? Well, if you think about the Greek term, the phenomene, that which appears, phenomenology would
I didn't know that.
be the science or the study of what's appearing. How is it
Mm.
appearing? Well, it's appearing in a lot of different ways, but it's appearing differently over time. And Hegel is seeing a progress. Not a progress in the sense of a steady drumbeat, everything just keeps getting better and better. It's possible to have setbacks. As a matter of fact, if we take away where Hegel, probably went wrong in thinking that history ended essentially in 1807, we might even think that the 20th century and part of the 21st century might have actually been a period of decline as
Yeah,
far as the development of the dialect goes.
certainly seems so.
Perhaps we need to rise up yet again. That's a bigger question that I just throw out there. Let's go back to this actual chapter then, or not chapter, but section. He says, knowledge as it begins, immediate spirit in its first phase, is the non-spiritual. Why? I mean, it's mental, right? Knowledge is in our heads. Well, remember, it has to have that sort of reflexivity. It can't just be something in a book over there, something that could be turned into, say, an algorithm,
Hmm.
something that can be totally external to a subject. Knowledge has to actually become subjective in the sense of becoming not necessarily aware of itself as a bit of knowledge, like a book looking at itself, thinking about itself, but through us. Through us. We are the ones who bring spirit into the equation. So he
Mm.
says, knowledge in the first phase is the non-spiritual, that is sense consciousness. When we're looking around at things, we're not necessarily engaging our intellects. To a certain degree we are, and insofar as we have to construe the things that are around us, we have to think through categories of causality, be able to classify things. Even if we're just like, hunting-gathering, we have to do, actually hunter-gatherers are pretty smart. You have to do a lot of problem solving and speculation. But still, it's tied primarily to sense impressions, to sense consciousness, to being taken up by the world around us. And if we think about pleasure and pain that way, very basic sense experiences, part of our sensibility, our manifold in that way,
Mm.
that's non-spiritual. It's not going to actually lead to great development unless something else comes into the picture. And that unless is really key here.
I know he's probably gonna touch on this, but oh my gosh, this reminds me. I had this. We're gonna go on a little bit of tangent here, but I had this conversation with a Well, barely a conversation. I was mostly listening to him. He was kind of ranting a little bit, but uh, in this car with the Lyft driver, and he was kind of talking about how, oh, some people are just illogical, irrational, things like this. And like, people have this idea all the time, right? Like, people are inherently rational, or some people are really irrational, illogical, whatever. But I was like, no, I don't think people are. I think people are inherently rational and logical, but they have the wrong information, right? Oftentimes, people are being logical, but the information set they're being logical on is in itself flawed, right? So it's irrational only or illogical only in the sense that other people who have better information sets or have different information sets don't understand their logic, right? And I think that's a huge important aspect of this. Hey, there goes my partner right there. Thank you for coming to the chat, baby. I appreciate you. She's great, absolutely fantastic. But yeah, the it depends on what your information set is, right? Depends on what your perceptions are, if you will. That will determine what what system of logic or rationality that you're even using. By that same token, I think things like emotion, like we often say, oh, emotions make you illogical or rational, but emotions are just another signal, right? This is it's another perception, if you will. It's kind of signaling to you what is going on in your body and how you physiologically react to certain information or certain stimuli, right? And depending on how you reflect on that, will determine how you act. And so I really like this idea here of this sense consciousness, because we do seem to have a initial knowledge base, an initial consciousness, just based on our perceptions and how we look at the world. And how we feel, and then we have another form on top of that, which is how we make those connections, how we rationalize further, try to put those pieces together between all those different forms of perception. So this is great.
So he says, in order to become genuine knowledge, in order to beget the element of science, which is the pure notion of science itself, pure notion or concept. And by this, he doesn't mean some little idea somewhere. He means something like a nexus of everything that goes into what comprises a scientific viewpoint upon things. So this is a finished position. This is where we aren't yet. Hegel thinks that he's reached that point, because obviously he's writing the preface to the Phenomenology of Spirit, which he's finished. He's writing the preface after all of that. But we're not there yet. How do we get there? Through work, through progress. And if we actually did this according to scale, this should be a much, much longer arrow, and it should be broken up into all sorts of some dead ends and some cul-de-sacs and some veering off this way and veering off that way. But we simplified it quite a bit. He
It's a
says
messy process.
this process of coming to be, considering the content and patterns it will display therein, and then he gives us some cautions about it. That's what the Phenomenology of Spirit is. That's what this whole book is chock full of, is the map that these great explorers have traversed in moving away from sense consciousness through all sorts of other shapes of consciousness, eventually to, with Hegel, genuine knowledge. And he says, I want to caution you against three things that this isn't. So, what's the first one? He says, it will not be what's commonly understood as an initiation of the unscientific consciousness into science. This will not be like a biology 101, a botany 101, even ethics 101, because we can talk about moral science, sort of class where we reduce everything down as best we can to the simplest elements and try to make sure that we have accessible texts that are easy for people to get into. He's not going to try to pull any punches. He's not going to water anything down. This is going to be a long, arduous process, and it's not like you can jump from here all the way to here, nor is it, as a lot of people like to do, can you just read up to the master-slave dialectic and say, okay, I've got Hegel now, because there's a lot more to the story. So it's not going to be like that. It's actually going to require us to work a lot harder than if we were taking a survey class. It will also be quite different from the foundation of science. Hegel is not foundationalist in the sense that we're going to get the foundation all figured out first, and that will be indubitable, or at least we'll have sort of an inductive certainty about it, and then we'll move from there to build up stuff.
Mm.
I mean, that's great if you can actually do that. Turns out that in most things you can't. We're already in process. We're already moving along. So we need to be able to figure out how to sort of build the boat as we're sailing it.
Mm.
Then he also says, least of all will it be like the rapturous enthusiasm, which like a shot from a pistol begins straight away with absolute knowledge and makes short work of other standpoints by declaring it takes no notice of them. We've already seen the rejection of the sort of appeals to intuition. And Hegel says, absolute knowledge is something that we're going to achieve eventually. It's not something you get to assume from the start and say, we've already got this. Because if you do that, you're never going to actually make this work. You're never going to actually do the progress. Because you're going to say, all of that, I don't really need it. What
Right.
that means is that the person who claims to have that sort of absolute knowledge actually doesn't. The person who does have absolute knowledge can look back on the entire development and have seen how to progress through it, because they actually themselves had to work to attain it. And this would be what Hegel is saying his own condition is, and this is what Hegel is sort of promising to us if we make our way through the phenomenology.
Let's go. I like that.
The task of leading the individual from his uneducated standpoint to knowledge had to be seen in its universal sense, just as it was the universal individual, self-conscious spirit, whose formative education had to be studied.
Mm.
As regards the relation between them, every moment, as it gains concrete form and a shape of its own, displays itself in the universal individual. The single individual is incomplete spirit, a concrete shape in whose whole existence one determinateness predominates, the others being present in a blurred outline.
Mm. Hold up. I like that. Passive leading the individual from this uneducated standpoint to knowledge had to be seen in its universal sense. So the moving of people from this kind of level of not really understanding and not knowing stuff to that better form of knowledge, has to come in this overarching framework here, just as it was the universal individual, self-conscious spirit whose formative education had to be studied, right? You have to look at why are we self-conscious? Why are we, looking and see things the ways that we do? Why do we think the way that we do, right? As regards in the relation between them, every moment as it gains concrete form and a shape of its own displays itself in the universal individual. The single individual is incomplete spirit, a concrete shape in whose whole existence one determinateness predominates, the other being present only in blurred outline. Interesting. I'm not sure about this latter part, but this first part, the single individual is incomplete spirit, right? Going back to that what we mentioned before, where no one person can hold all of this knowledge. No one man can hold all that power, right? Like we need more. We need to come together. We need to figure this stuff out collectively, and of course that's what he thinks he's doing. He thinks he's in the 1800s taking all that knowledge, all that information from all that history up into that time and putting it together. But I think we need to do that again because it's been a lot of progress since then, and we need to. I think it's a good time to do that once again. And maybe in 100 years, 200 years, if we're still here, people will do that once more. Hopefully, the concrete shape in whose whole existence one determinateness predominates, the other being present only in blurred outline. Mm. So I guess like I don't know. I might need him to explain this part to me. I get it sort of, but for some reason it's not 100% clicking. I
Since
don't know.
one determinateness predominates, the others being present in a blurred outline. In a spirit that is more advanced than another, the lower concrete existence has been reduced to an inconspicuous moment.
Mm.
What used to be the important thing is now but a trace. Its pattern is shrouded to become a mere shadowy outline.
Oh, okay.
The individual whose substance is the more advanced spirit runs through this past just as one who takes up a higher science goes through the preparatory studies he has long since absorbed in order to bring their content to mind. He recalls them to the inward eye, but has no lasting interest in them.
Mm.
The single individual must also pass through the formative stages of universal spirit so far as their content is concerned, but as shapes which spirit has already left behind, as stages on a way that has been made level with toil. Thus, as far as factual information is concerned, we must find that what in former ages engaged the attention of men with a mature mind has been reduced to the level of facts, exercises, and even games for children. And in the child's progress through school, we shall recognize the history of the cultural development of the world traced, as it were, in a silhouette.
Mm.
This past experience is the already acquired property of universal spirit, which constitutes the substance of the individual, and hence appears externally to him as his inorganic nature. In this respect, formative education, regarded from the side of the individual, consists in his acquiring what lies at hand, devouring his inorganic nature, and taking possession of it for himself.
Ooh, a lot of great stuff. Now, I might be off track here, but this seems like some really relevant stuff to once again to today. Thus, as far as the factual information is concerned, we find that what in former ages engaged the intention of men and men of nature, oh goodness, of men of mature mind has been reduced to the level of facts, exercises, and even games for children. So that oversimplification, right, kind of extracts some of the important bits of this. And this is a kind of um, critique I had of modern education today is the fact that in our efforts to educate everyone, right, to make sure everybody has a shared understanding of things, what we're actually doing is kind of stripping a lot of the nuance, right, stripping a lot of the complexity, stripping a lot of the effort that takes to grasp, this level of knowledge. Um, at the cost of that knowledge. So yeah, we've achieved the ability to make almost everybody literate, at least in America, right? I think what 90 something percent literate rates, literacy rates, which is huge upgrade from the early 1900s, which were what we were like what 10% literacy rate or something crazy like that. So yeah, we've improved a lot in that sense, but anybody would tell you today that most people don't really um, take in much education, much they don't retain much information, right? They don't retain much ability to um, employ critical thinking and all these other things that we know people need to make sense of the world and to be able to parse good information from bad. Um, and what do we do with that? Like how do we square that? Right? Is what we gained really as important as what we lost, right? I don't know. I personally think that instead of us trying to educate everybody the same way to the same levels and everything like that, we should be thinking about how to encourage each person individually to want to learn in the first place. Like figure out what inspires them or what motivates them, what incentivizes them to learn, and I don't mean from from the sense of, oh, I know how to count now, but like what actually inspires them to use math, to use language, to use, these different areas of knowledge in order to have a better understanding of the world and use that, you know, um, in the future, right? How do we do more of that? I think that will be more important, and furthermore, still it will still encourage literacy, right? It will still encourage what we care about because now people will want to use it and they will see when and where and how they can use it, right? This is going back to Hegel's earlier point. We should demand from science an explanation of why we should care, right? We should demand that. But in current education, we can't, right? You ask your teacher, why are we learning this? You say, oh, because it's on a test, because you have to. That's not an explanation, right? That doesn't that doesn't encourage you to want to learn more. And so we have to do more of that in our education system. We can't force people to learn just because we think we know what's good for them. Because if we force people to do that, they won't engage with it. They will just do it the least amount as possible. And then afterwards, they won't use it ever again just to spite you, or just because they were forced to in the first place. This is why you see so many people who never read a book, nowadays. Um, I'm going on a whole rant here, but yeah, like this really hit me right here. Um, and I get it, right? It's important to teach people to read and write and do math and all this other stuff. But if we're forcing them to do so, and if we're reducing, oversimplifying all this knowledge and education and history that we have and the effort to do so, then it kind of loses the whole point, right? Um, I don't know. Well, let's continue.
Element of the world
Where were
traced,
we?
as it were, in a silhouette. This past
Oh, right. We went over all this. This past existence is already acquired property of universal spirit, which constitutes the substance of the individual, and hence appears externally to him as his inorganic nature. That's interesting, right there. The inorganic nature. It's like natural, but it doesn't come up organically. It doesn't grow from within, or it doesn't seem natural, but it feels natural. At least that's how I'm kind of taking this. In this respect, formative education, regarded from the side of the individual, consists in his acquiring what thus lies at hand, devouring his inorganic nature, and taking possession of it for himself, right? But regarded from the side of universal spirit as substance, this is nothing but its own acquisition of self consciousness, the bringing about of its own becoming and reflection into itself.
becoming and reflection into itself.
Let's see what he
In
says.
section 28,
Because
Hegel
I
is
went on
telling
a
us
rant with
more
that,
about this
sorry.
big book that he's written, The Phenomenology of Spirit, and he's telling us, not in these terms, but that it's essentially a story of coming to age for what he calls the universal individual. That is spirit, Geist, mind. Now, this is a long, long story, and it begins far in the past, and we can ask ourselves, is it leading up to the present? Is it leading up to what's for us, 2 centuries past of 1807? Second edition, I think, in the 1840s. Or is it about our present and perhaps even the future? Those are things that we need to clarify. And how far back in the past does it go? But now is not the point for us to actually try to set those determinations down hard and fast. We want to see what's the general structure of this and how does it connect with other individuals. So, for example, ancient Greeks, Socrates. Is Socrates somebody who could be thrust into the present as is, like, for example, that recent book, Plato at the Googleplex? You just sort of update him and bring him in and sit him down, and he gets up to speed pretty quickly, and then starts asking a lot of questions. Could we do that sort of thing? Perhaps we could, because those were individuals who were what we call world historic. They were furthering the advance of spirit. They were making some sort of advance. They were developing things beyond where they were, what they found, and they were doing so through the development of their being, of their consciousness. But they only went from here to here, and maybe another individual goes from here to here, and another individual goes from here to here. And again, if we were
Pass the
trying to
baton.
depict the dialectic, we would need one gigantic arrow, and the little advances would be considerably smaller. Some of them would be longer than others, but they wouldn't be that direct. So he said the task of leading the individual from his uneducated standpoint in the past or in our contemporary present had to be seen in its universal sense, just as it was the universal individual, self-conscious spirit, whose formative education had to be studied. Studied by who? Well, studied by Hegel. Studied by others before him, because Hegel doesn't see himself as having no predecessors whatsoever. It's not as if nobody has ever studied the development of culture and the process by which, and this is something just amazing about human beings, we don't have to reinvent everything every single generation, so long as culture can bring us up to speed through our processes of education and development as new individuals. So, for example, my father taught me mathematics, and he began when I was in a rigorous way, when I was about 4 years old, because I had an aptitude for that. Now, he was able to use a calculator to get me interested in it, so there's a little technological device, and that could have only happened in the 1970s or afterwards. As a matter of fact, he probably could not have gotten me interested in it by using a calculator today. I'm not sure that it would have the same sort of semi-magical effect on a kid as it did, in 1970 when video games were at that time, Pong and Space Invader and Asteroids. Um,
Hmm.
what's going on through this entire historical process of development? One of the terms that Hegel is not using so much here, but are going to be playing a major role, is in German, Gestalt. It's often translated as form or shape,
Use that a lot in
structure. When we talk
design.
about Gestalt philosophy, we mean the properties that a whole has when it's put together that are different than the parts. So for example, this diagram is a Gestalt because each of the elements is arranged in relation to each other, and it would not have the same meaning if we took out some of the things. Now, Hegel talks in terms of Gestalten, that's the plural, shapes of consciousness. So we're talking about his view is that through history, people are sort of working out these dynamics. They're going through these structures, these shapes of consciousness. One of them, one important one is, say, the dialectic between, master and slave, or lord and bondsman, if you prefer the older translation, whereby the slave is put to work basically through threats and through being having force imposed upon them by the master, and the master is then able to enjoy objects through the mediation of the slave. The slave continues to develop. The master only has pleasure and doesn't continue to develop in this progression. Slave's not entirely happy after developing and actually becomes the unhappy consciousness,
Mm.
which is a different gestalt, a different shape of consciousness. So the universal individual has been progressing through these. That's why at different stages in history, human beings are primarily focused on different issues, on different goods, on different questions, because there is
I realize now I was wrong in my whole rant. Well, it's not like my rant is wrong, I don't think, but I was focusing on the wrong thing. He's more so referring to, standing on the shoulders of giants, the fact that we can learn things based on what was there before, right? Like we now can know about quantum physics and things like that because of Newton, his Newtonian physics, which is an earlier model, and which we've now kind of updated and things like that into relativity. Um, those are two different things, relativity and quantum physics, but it's same principles, right? But yeah, that's it. That's it. That's a great point. I wasn't even thinking about in this avenue.
progress.
I still retain that we reducify or we oversimplify what we're learning. I think we can do both. Like have fundamentals or building blocks that we can have each generation build upon at the same time without stripping all of the nuance and complexity of these things in order to mass educate, right? It's like trying to mass production, like trying to use mass industry type of format as opposed to a local um, uh, individualistic approach, right?
It could also be because there's decline, too, in some cases. Although Hegel is not going to focus on the decline in this. To a certain degree, he does in his philosophy of history. So he says, the task of leading the individual had to be seen in its universal sense. The single individual, myself, or even one of these people who played a role, is an incomplete spirit, a concrete shape in whose whole existence one determinateness predominates. So, for example, Socrates was not all of Athens. He did not represent all of Athens.
Right,
That's
right.
why he got killed by the Athenians, because so many other people were like, yeah, that guy's got to go. And they voted to do so. And there were other people who represented things. If you think about a Platonic dialogue, different people are presenting different ways of thinking, of acting, of being, of relating to other people, of making arguments, of arranging goods. So he says, if we look at it in the big picture, the single individual is incomplete.
Right.
In a spirit that is more advanced than another, the lower concrete existence has been reduced to an inconspicuous moment. This is a key idea. So there's actually progress. In a spirit or an individual who is lower, again, if we want to use this little schema here, the O person has incorporated what the X person has, and now they're going forward, and they're taking what they've got, and then this person takes what they've got, and they go
Mm.
forward with it as well. So, we can think about this in economic terms. As wealth is acquired, families are able to do more with that wealth. If we think about knowledge, about the advances that we have seen in all sorts of fields of knowledge. We could think about this in terms of the arts, in terms of the humanities, in terms of learning how to actually live a life where you're not a jerk to other people. All of these sorts of things. When we have progress, this is going to bother some people. The people who are back here on the hind end, they become these sort of shadowy, almost non-entities,
Mm.
except insofar as they had something to transfer to us. They almost don't matter as far as the universal process goes. Except that's not really the case. Let's go on and see what else he says. He says, the individual whose substance is the more advanced spirit runs through this past, just as one who takes up a higher science goes through the preparatory studies. In order to bring the content to mind, he recalls them to the inward eye, but he has no lasting interest in them. So when we look again, for example, at the master-slave dialectic, we're not looking at that because we think that's the pattern for all human society. This is one way in which a lot of people go wrong in interpreting Hegel. We're looking at it because it was important in the past and did set the framework for things, but didn't absolutely determine them. And we're looking at it precisely because it has been surpassed,
Mm.
according to Hegel. Not surpassed in the sense that we've dealt with all violence, all expropriation, all exploitation of a human being by human beings, but because we've gone on to more complicated forms that are, in a certain respect, more interesting and more enduring. And if we want to see where we've come to and fully understand it, we need to look back into this past and look at all the previous shapes of consciousness. So he says, the single individual must pass through the formative stages of universal spirit so far as their content is concerned, but as shapes which spirit has already left behind, as stages on a way that has been made level with toil. It's because of the work that was done in the past that we're able to actually look back at the past and say, that's what was going on with them. That's what was important with them. It doesn't have absolute importance the way that they assumed that it did. Let's think, for example, about the Reformation and the wars of religion and the fact that these people were willing to not only kill each other over that. I mean, getting people to kill each other is not really that difficult. What was really troubling about the wars of religion was that people were willing to lie. And you might say, "Oh, religion, people are always willing to lie." Well, no. If you look and you actually do your historical research, which doesn't just mean reading some books or watching the History Channel, that means actually sort of immersing yourself in the literature of that time, trying to get the mindset, trying to wrap your head around the
Mm.
shapes of
What
consciousness
people
of that
actually
time,
thought at
you
that time.
realize that this really troubled people.
Hmm.
That's just one example. We can go back and we can look, but the path has been made flat for us to go back and do so. And it's even more so since we've got it here in a book, which is supposed to encapsulate all the important shapes of consciousness. So he says, as far as factual information is concerned, we find that what in former ages engaged the attention of men of mature mind has been reduced to the level of facts, exercises, and even games for children. Think, for example, if you know anything about the history of mathematics, about the development of the integral calculus. Now, most people, if they're doing high school, they're not going to actually get to calculus, and most people are probably not going to study calculus if they go to college. But calculus is really, sort of a building block for further things, and it's a lot of fun, actually. But I have to say, because I really enjoyed learning calculus, because I learned about, the theories of it when I was an undergraduate, the theory of limits. Leibniz had to work his butt off, and so did Isaac Newton, in order to be able to figure this stuff out. How are you measuring rates of change? They had to wrap their heads around it. It wasn't just like playing with the numbers and getting the numbers right. It was coming up with a metaphysics that then the notation could go into, and they actually got into a big tiff about who invented it first.
Mm.
We can teach it as a textbook. We can teach it to people who aren't even particularly bright or motivated because it's from that past. So he says, in the child's
Question
progress
is,
through school, and this is
do we actually teach it, right? Like, we can say we teach it, but do they retain it, right? For specifically for people who aren't motivated or who don't have that aptitude. Like I say that as a person who loved math but didn't have the aptitude to grasp things like that, like calculus and everything like that. I kind of peaked at geometry and trigonometry. When we began to get into calculus, I was just it just wasn't clicking for me, right? Maybe I just didn't find the right method or the right way of looking at it or whatever, but I just don't think we're doing as much as we think we are. I think we can teach it to people who want to learn it, who are motivated, and or who are who have the aptitude for it, but I think it's questionable if we can actually teach people who don't care, who don't want to learn it, and things like that. Um, but I guess another conversation.
Of course, somebody who actually goes, to a school where people care, where they teach things,
Oh, there
where
we
they're
go.
not totally distracted by, we could go on and on. The child progresses through school. We shall recognize the history of the cultural development that the world traced, as it were, in a silhouette. In a silhouette. Now, think about what a silhouette is. It's not the thing itself, it's only the image of it, and it's not even the
The
full
shape
image,
of
it's
it.
only the outline of it. It says this past experience is the already acquired property of universal spirit, which constitutes the substance of the individual, and hence appears externally to him as his inorganic nature. So, education comes to us from the outside, we feel. Sometimes educators want to say, educare means leading outward, but actually a lot of education is just imposing stuff on students and
Mm-hmm.
saying, read this book and do these exercises. And it feels very external.
Mm-hmm.
Why? Because the students have not actually had these sort of formative experiences of dealing with, as Hegel said, the patience and labor of the negative, having to work these things out. But we're able to enter into those sorts of things imaginatively by looking at this entire progression and focusing on these states of consciousness and sort of placing ourselves within the middle of the story.
Mm.
So he says, in this respect, formative education consists in acquiring what thus lies to hand, devouring his inorganic nature, taking possession of it. But, regarded from the side of universal spirit of substance, this is nothing but its own acquisition of self-consciousness, the bringing about of its own becoming and reflection into itself. So this progress of history, the history of human beings, is leading to a limit point where science can at last become conscious of itself. Now, notice too, again, I've stressed this several times, science does not just mean the natural sciences nor the social sciences. Wissenschaft, in a Hegelian sense, means something that is systematic, that tries to extend itself to all of reality, that tries to make itself adequate even to the individual, to the particular,
Mm.
that does not reject things and say, that's not scientific, we're not going to think about it, but tries to incorporate even that.
Mm.
That means that science has to develop historical awareness, which is what the phenomenology is supposed to be doing. That's supposed to
Mm.
be providing us.
I'm beginning to see. I think I'm beginning to see the shape of why this didn't take off. Of why Hegelian kind of view of science is not really the fundamental thing that we use today. I do think it is valuable, and we probably should look at it again. But it sounds like a good reason why it's probably not prevalent today, or as prevalent, um, is because it's too big, right? Is because the idea that we don't dismiss things as unscientific. Instead, we say, okay, why do you think that, right? And let's see if we can incorporate this into this bigger idea, and see how we can bring all this together, and explain both on the individual and collective level all this other stuff. It seems to be too ambitious of an undertaking for most people, and I mean that just not only for beginners but also for experts, right? People in this field who want to be experts in their field. They want to specialize too much. A lot of people want to specialize into a specific field and know as best as most as they can from that field, and then whether or not it applies to other fields, or how it applies to other fields, doesn't really matter as much, right? And we have gained from that, sure, right? We've gained quite a bit from specialists going as far as they can down one path, and then seeing how we can bring that into other places. But the fact is that many scientists in Hegel's time and earlier, right, were multi-potentialites, were polymaths, right? They weren't specialists. They didn't look at one type of science or one type of learning or anything like that. They looked at a whole bunch of different things, right? Like Newton, um, he was into a lot of stuff, all right. Same for Darwin, I think. I think a lot of these guys were even the early philosophers. They called them these philosophers were basically the early scientists. They incorporated all of reality as much as they could into one body of knowledge, or tried to. All right. But in our attempts to specialize, we've kind of lost that. So yeah, we gained some things, but we've also lost some things, and I'm not sure if if you made a cost benefits analysis, right? If it squares, right? I'm not really sure. Some people will probably say, or at least assume, that we've gained more than what we lost, but I think that's questionable, right? And I'm curious. I'm very, very super, even more curious now to see, more about this because this is. I'm telling you, man. The more we get into this, um, the more awesome it is. But yeah, that's it for now. As always, thanks for watching. Let me know what you think in the comments below, and what you got from this, what you learned from this, where you think I may have gotten wrong or anything like that. And yeah, thanks again.